The distress signal came in at 3:47 in the morning, station time. It was a small, weak sound in the middle of a very large and quiet universe. Most people on the Steadfast Resolve were asleep. The lights in the corridors were turned down low, and the only noise was the steady hum of the ship's engines and the soft beeping of monitoring equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Briggs was not asleep. He was sitting at his desk in his small office, drinking cold coffee and reading maintenance reports about broken equipment that nobody had fixed yet. He was not having a good night. The coffee was bad, the reports were worse, and the recycler in the corner of his room kept making a clicking sound every few minutes that he could not figure out how to stop. When the alert chimed, he looked up from the report he was reading and checked the screen on his desk. A distress beacon. He leaned forward and read the data slowly and carefully. The signal was coming from a place called Varith 5. It was a small mining colony, deep in contested space, territory that different alien governments argued over and none of them fully controlled. The beacon's code told him everything he needed to know right away. This was not a broken machine or a power failure. Someone on that colony had pressed an emergency button because soldiers had come. Briggs set his coffee mug down. He stood up and walked to the bridge. The duty officer on the bridge was a young man named Cole Hargrove. Cole was 22 years old, had a thin face, and always looked a little nervous when Briggs walked onto the bridge at unusual hours. He was looking nervous now. "Sir," Cole said, already pulling up information on his screen. "I saw the same beacon. The Cooperative Emergency Council reviewed it about 3 hours ago." "What did they decide?" Briggs asked. Cole hesitated. "They voted to defer response. The sector is listed as contested. 3 Vreth patrol routes cross within range of the colony. The council said the risk was too high for a standard rescue operation." Briggs stood still for a moment. He looked at the beacon data on Cole's main screen. The colony on Varith 5 had a total population of just over 400 people. Families, mostly. People who had gone out to a gray rock in the far edges of space to dig minerals out of the ground and send them back to the inner systems. They had built homes there. They had children there. "How many children?" Briggs asked. Cole checked his records. 93. Children under 16 years old. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. The bridge was silent except for the ship's systems. Cole watched him carefully, the way junior officers watched senior officers when they could sense a decision coming. "Wake the battalion," Briggs said. "Full kit. Boots on the hangar deck in 40 minutes. Cole's hand moved toward his console, then stopped. He looked up. "Sir, we don't have authorization from Cooperative Command. If we launch without a formal tasking order, there will be questions." "There will be." "Cole," Briggs said. He said it quietly. 93 kids. Cole looked at him for one more second. Then he hit the alert. The sound rang through the ship, a long, rising tone that every Marine on the Steadfast Resolve had been trained to respond to without thinking. In the barracks module, lights came on. Bodies moved. Boots hit the floor. Staff Sergeant Lena Carr was on her feet before the second pulse of the alarm finished. She had been in the military for 9 years and her body had learned to wake up fast. She pulled on her gear harness and tightened her boot laces in the dark without looking down. Around her, the 6 other members of her squad were doing the same, quick, practiced movements, no wasted motion, no conversation yet. Private First Class Danny Okafor was the youngest member of the squad. He was 20 years old, tall, and had a habit of asking questions at moments when everyone else was already moving. "Where are we going?" he asked, pulling his helmet liner over his head. Corporal Tia Flores was checking the early mission data on her wrist unit. She read 2 lines of it, then looked up at Danny with a calm expression. "Someone pressed a beacon," she said. "They need help." Danny nodded and said nothing more. That was enough for him. It was enough for all of them. Down in the hangar deck, the noise grew. 240 Marines in full gear filled the space with the sounds of weapons being checked, equipment being loaded, and squad leaders calling names to confirm everyone was present. The dropship sat in rows, their ramps already lowered, their engines beginning to warm up. Briggs walked through the hangar and watched his people work. They were fast. They were quiet in the way that well-trained soldiers are quiet, not because they were nervous, but because they knew exactly what they were doing and did not need to talk about it. Some of them had been in situations like this before. Some had not. But all of them moved the same way. A sergeant named Greg Ewan fell into step beside Briggs near the back of the hangar. Greg was a compact man with a calm face and very sharp eyes. He had been Briggs's right hand for 3 years. Cooperative passed on it. Greg asked. They did. So we go anyway. We go anyway, Briggs confirmed. Greg was quiet for a beat. Then he said, good. And that was the full extent of his opinion on the matter. 38 minutes after Cole had hit the alarm, the first dropship lifted off the hangar deck. The second followed 10 seconds later. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. One by one they rose and moved through the launch corridor and out into the dark space between the stars. On Varith 5, the distress beacon was still transmitting. It had been transmitting for 11 hours. Nobody had answered it yet. The Marines were on their way. Varith 5 was not a beautiful planet. From above, in the dropships, it looked like a gray stone someone had forgotten in a corner of the galaxy, flat plains of pale rock, low ridges worn smooth by thousands of years of wind, and a sky the color of old ash. There were no trees, no water visible from the air, and no color anywhere except the faint orange glow of the colony's processing equipment burning through the dust. The dropships came in low. Very low. They flew without lights, without radio signals, without anything that another ship's sensors might pick up and identify. The pilots navigated by terrain mapping radar alone, reading the ground below them in thin green lines on their displays, threading between the ridges and staying under the natural radar shadow of the landscape. Inside the lead ship, Briggs sat near the front with Greg Ewan beside him and a dozen squad leaders arranged in 2 rows facing each other along the sides of the cabin. Nobody was talking. The ship shook slightly as it moved through the upper wind layer, and a few Marines braced their boots against the floor, but otherwise there was no movement. They sat still and waited, the way soldiers wait before something begins. At 800 meters out from the colony, the pilot cut the engines. The dropship went nearly silent. It glided the rest of the way on momentum and gravity, descending in a long smooth arc toward the dry riverbed that the terrain maps had identified as a good landing point. The other 4 ships did the same behind it, spacing themselves out, landing in sequence without a single engine firing. The ramp came down. Briggs was first off. The cold hit him immediately. The air on Varith 5 was thin and sharp, and it smelled like sulfur and iron dust. The wind came from the northwest at a steady pace. Briggs crouched at the edge of the riverbed, pulled out his thermal scope, and looked at the colony 2 kilometers away. What he saw was not good, but it was not as bad as the worst possibility. The colony was a ring of connected buildings around a central hub, a large, boxy structure that served as the main meeting space, medical station, and storage area for the settlement. The outer buildings were dark. The hub had emergency lighting running, casting pale yellow squares of light onto the gray ground around it. 4 large Vreth military vehicles were parked at the colony's main gate. The Vreth were a tall species, broader than humans, with layered natural armor over their shoulders and upper bodies that their combat suits added to rather than replaced. Briggs could see 8 of them moving at the gate and around the vehicles. More would be inside. Through the thermal scope, the heat signatures of the colonists were all grouped together in one part of the hub. A tight cluster of orange and yellow shapes, barely moving. They had been put in one room and kept there. The children would be among them. Greg appeared at Briggs's right side without making a sound. He had a habit of doing that. It still surprised some of the newer Marines, though the veterans had learned to expect it. 8 outside contacts, at least that many inside, Greg said quietly, reading from his own scope. 4 vehicles, crew-served weapons on 2 of them. I can see a motion sensor grid along the outer perimeter. Can we get under it? Briggs asked. Yes. Their sensors are calibrated for large movement. If we go in dispersed order, single file with wide spacing, we should pass below the detection threshold. We have to move slowly for the first 50 meters. Briggs lowered the scope and turned to look behind him. His Marines were spread along the riverbed in a long quiet line, crouched in the dark, waiting. 240 people, and not one of them was making unnecessary noise. The wind moved across the gray rock and that was the only sound. He opened his command channel and spoke in a low, steady voice. Squad leaders received their assignments in under 10 minutes. Lena Carr and her team would take the colony's southern utility tunnel, a maintenance access point that the colony's own building plans, pulled from public records hours ago aboard the ship, showed running under the eastern wall. Greg's element would handle the vehicles, disabling the drive systems and weapons mounts to make sure none of them could move or fire during the operation. 2 other squads would hold the outer perimeter and watch for any Vreth forces coming from outside the colony. The remaining Marines would stack near the hub's main entrance and wait for Briggs's signal. No one asked questions. No one raised objections. Inside the hub, things were tense but still. The colonists had been moved into the main meeting room 2 hours earlier. They sat on the floor, on benches, wherever there was space. Parents held children close. Older residents sat very still, the way people sit when they are afraid and are trying not to show it. A Velkai woman named Surith, small, elderly, with the slow careful movements of someone who had lived a very long time, sat near the back wall with a young girl of about 7 years old pressed against her side. The girl's name was Nina. Her mother was across the room, separated from her in the confusion when the Vreth soldiers had pushed everyone inside. Nina had not cried, but her eyes were very large and very still. Surith had been on Vareth 5 for 9 years. She had seen difficult things in her long life, but she had never been in a room like this, held by soldiers, waiting for a decision she had no part in making. She kept one hand on Nina's shoulder and watched the door. Near the front of the room, colony headwoman Petra Stamos stood apart from the others, facing the Vreth commander. Petra was a plain-spoken woman in her late 40s who had spent 11 years building this colony from almost nothing. She was not easily frightened. She was frightened now, but she kept her face neutral and her arms crossed, which was how she handled things that scared her. The Vreth commander, a senior officer named Dresholin, had been speaking for several minutes through a translation device. The terms were simple: hand over the colony's mining licenses, equipment, and stored ore. In exchange, the colonists would be allowed to leave on their transport ships with their personal belongings. Petra listened to all of it. Then she said, "I sent a distress beacon 11 hours ago." Dresholin's translator buzzed. "The cooperative will not come. This sector belongs to the Dominion. Your signal was received and set aside." Petra looked at the floor for a moment. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls of the hub, and the building made a faint low sound. Inside, nobody moved. She looked back up at Dresholin. "Not everyone out here is the cooperative," she said. Dresholin did not answer right away. He was still processing the sentence when, without any warning at all, every light in the building went out. The darkness lasted less than 2 seconds before the colonists began to react. Some people gasped. A child somewhere in the room started to cry. There was shuffling and the sound of people pressing closer together, trying to find the people they knew by touch in the total blackness. The Vreth soldiers reacted differently. They were trained soldiers and they moved fast, reaching for weapon lights, turning to cover the doors, shouting short commands to each other in their own language. Dresholin stepped back toward the wall. His hand found his sidearm. None of it mattered. Corporal Tia Flores had cut the power to the hub's main lighting array 14 seconds after her squad entered the southern utility tunnel. She had identified the correct circuit breakers on her first pass down the corridor, waited for Briggs's signal on the command channel, and then opened every one of them at the same moment. The entire facility went dark at once. Terran Marines did not need the lights. Their night vision equipment ran on a completely separate power system, compact, self-contained units built into their helmets that turned the dark green and clear. Through those lenses, the inside of the hub looked almost bright. Every person in that room was visible. Every Vreth soldier was visible. Every doorway and corridor was visible. Lena Carr came through the eastern access door at a run, her squad stacked behind her in a tight line. They moved fast and they moved in silence. The 2 Vreth soldiers nearest the east door were still turning toward the sound when Lena and Danny Okafor reached them. They went down hard under heavy stun charges, non-lethal rounds that hit like a wall and dropped them where they stood. Neither of them had fired a shot. Lena did not slow down. Across the hub, in the northern corridor, Greg Yuen's element was moving through the building the same way, fast, quiet, deliberate. A Vreth soldier came around a corner at speed and walked directly into Greg's path. The soldier was large. Greg was not especially large, but he was moving fast and wearing full armor, and he had been doing this for 12 years. The meeting was brief. The soldier went down. Greg stepped over him and kept moving. At the main entrance, Briggs pushed through the door with 4 Marines at his back. The meeting room was full of noise, the colonists reacting to the darkness, some of them crying, some calling out names, all of them confused and afraid. In the middle of it all, Dresholin had his back to the wall and was drawing his weapon. Briggs crossed the room in 4 steps and put his hand around Dresholin's wrist before the weapon cleared the holster. "Leave it," he said, in clear standard. He said it the same way he might say good morning, calm, simple, without anger. Dresholin was a veteran soldier. He had been in active service for 19 years. He had fought in 7 separate campaign seasons across 3 different star systems. In all of that time, across all of those battlefields, he had never once failed to hear an enemy approach. He had not heard this one at all. Not a single sound. Not a footstep. Nothing. "How?" he started. "Training," Briggs said. He increased the pressure on the wrist just enough to make his meaning clear. Dresholin released the weapon. Outside, the 4 Vreth vehicles fell silent one by one. Greg's vehicle's team moved methodically from crawler to crawler, pulling drive components and disabling weapon mounts with the focused efficiency of people who had rehearsed exactly this kind of work. The crew served weapons on the 2 front vehicles, large, heavy guns mounted on rotating platforms, were taken apart and left inoperable in under 4 minutes. Neither of them fired. The command channel opened up. Squad leaders checked in. Northern corridor clear. Eastern corridor clear. Southern tunnel secure. Perimeter held. Vehicles disabled. All Vreth contacts accounted for, 12 in total, all taken without lethal force, all alive and conscious or lightly stunned. 0 Terran casualties. 0 Vreth casualties. Briggs held Dresholin's wrist for another moment, then let go. He stepped back. He keyed his command channel. "Where are the children?" he asked. Lena Carr's voice came back almost immediately. She had already found them. The children had been moved to a back storage room early in the standoff, taken there by a quick-thinking colonist named Owen Draper, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who repaired the colony's extraction equipment for a living and who had spent the last 2 hours reading the children stories in the dark to keep them calm. Owen was still there when Lena pushed open the storage room door. He was sitting on a crate with 4 small children pressed against him and a dozen more arranged on the floor around him. He had been reading from memory, making up words when he forgot them, keeping his voice steady and low. When the door opened, one of the younger children made a scared sound. "It is okay," Lena said. She pulled her helmet off so they could see her face. She had a plain, honest face and a calm voice, and she crouched down so she was at eye level with the smallest ones. "We came because your colony sent a signal. You are all safe now. We are going to bring you back to your families." Owen Draper looked at her for a long moment. His hands were shaking slightly, now that the danger was over. He had held them very still for 2 hours and now that he did not have to anymore, they shook. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out rough and uneven. "Don't thank me yet," Lena said. "Let's get everyone out first." When the emergency lighting came back on, the colony's backup power cells were separate from the main grid and had been deliberately left intact. The colonists in the meeting room found themselves looking at Terran Marines in dark armor standing calmly throughout the space. Dresholin and his soldiers were gathered near the east wall, their weapons collected, their hands visible. Petra Stamos stood in the middle of the room and looked at the large man in dark armor who was standing near her with the Vreth commander's sidearm held loosely at his side. The man looked back at her. "Are you the head woman?" he asked. "I am," Petra said. "We got your beacon." "I'm sorry it took us a few hours to get here." Petra stared at him. She had spent 2 hours believing that nobody was coming. She had stood in front of a Vreth commander and argued for time because she thought that was all she could do, buy a few more hours and hope for something she had almost stopped believing in. Now she looked at this man and at his soldiers moving quietly through her colony, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized she had been holding tight. She started to laugh. It was not a happy laugh or a relieved laugh. It was the laugh of someone whose body has too many feelings at once and does not know what else to do with them. The whole operation had taken 11 minutes. The mess hall on Vareth 5 was a narrow room with metal walls and long tables bolted to the floor. It smelled like instant coffee and cleaning fluid. The lights were harsh and white, the kind of lights that made everyone look a little tired. It was not a comfortable room, but it was warm, and after what had just happened, warm was enough. Briggs sat at one of the long tables across from Petra Stamos. His armor was still on. His helmet was clipped to his belt. He had the straight, settled posture of a man who had been in uniform for so long that sitting any other way felt strange. Petra poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the table without asking him if he wanted any. She set one in front of him and kept the other. The coffee was the instant grain kind, cheap, widely available, tasting like hot water that had once been near something brown. Briggs drank it without complaint. Around them, through the thin walls, they could hear the sounds of the colony coming back to life. Voices calling names. Footsteps in the corridors. A child crying, not the sharp frightened crying of someone in danger, but the wet, relieved kind of crying that happens when fear finally lets go. Owen Draper walked past the mess hall doorway holding his wife so tightly she had to tell him he could ease up. He did not ease up. The cooperative voted not to come, Petra said. She said it as a fact, not a question. They looked at the risk numbers and said the sector was too contested, Briggs told her. And you came anyway? Yes. Petra turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. She was looking at the table, not at him. Why? She asked. It was a simple question. She was not being difficult. She genuinely wanted to know. Briggs thought about how to answer that. He was not a man who gave speeches. He had given the official kind of speeches, the ones regulations said he had to give before major operations, short statements about purpose and mission and the people they were protecting. He gave those speeches adequately. But what Petra was asking was different. She was asking for the real reason. We had 93 children on the population list, he said finally. Someone was always going to come. Petra was quiet for a moment. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when an answer is simpler than they expected but also exactly right. A third person came into the mess hall then, small, slow, moving with great care. It was Surith, the elderly Velkai woman who had been in the storage room with the children. She walked to the table and settled into a chair across from both of them, taking her time. Nina, the 7-year-old girl, had been returned to her mother in the corridor, but Surith had stayed close. She looked at Briggs for a long moment with her pale, age-fogged eyes. Then she began to speak. Other species ask us about humans, she said. Her translator device rendered her words into flat but clear standard. They ask the Velkai, because we have been in the cooperative for 300 years. We have seen many things. They want to know why humans were admitted at all. Briggs raised an eyebrow slightly. He didn't say anything. Humans are difficult, Surith continued. They are loud. They argue. They do not follow established procedures. They act without authorization. They make the council nervous. She paused. Other species look at humans and they see a problem. I will file the authorization paperwork when we get back to the ship, Briggs said. Surith made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell with Velkai. I am sure you will. That is not the point I am making. She looked down at her own hands for a moment. I have been alive a long time, she said. Long enough to remember 14 separate distress calls that came to the Cooperative Emergency Council from worlds in contested zones. 14 beacons, just like the one Petra sent last night. The council reviewed each of them. They considered the risk. They voted to defer. They are still deferring. She looked up. 14 worlds. Still waiting. The mess hall was quiet. In the corridor outside, someone laughed, a real, full laugh, the kind that only happens when something terrible is over. Tonight, Surith said, a human officer looked at the same maps the council looked at. He saw the same contested territory. He read the same risk numbers. And he got up and came anyway. She looked at Briggs steadily. That is what I tell the other species when they ask about humans. That is the answer. You are the ones who still come. When the council defers, when the forms are not filled out, when the sector is contested and the risk is high and everyone else is still sitting in their chairs talking about it, the humans are already moving. Briggs said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that. Through the mess hall doorway, they could see part of the main corridor. Lena Carr was walking down it with a small girl beside her, Nina, who had been reunited with her mother but had apparently decided to stay close to the tall Marine who had come through the storage room door with a calm voice and an honest face. Nina was carrying her stuffed toy under one arm. She was talking. Lena was listening seriously, nodding at the appropriate moments, as though the conversation was very important. Petra watched this for a long time. "Thank you," she said at last. She said it simply, without decoration. She meant it for everything. The signal answered, the soldiers stopped, the children brought out safely, all of it. Briggs picked up his grain coffee. It still tasted like hot water with ambitions. "Don't mention it," he said. Part 5, The Record. 3 days after the operation on Verith 5, Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Briggs filed his after-action report aboard the Steadfast Resolve. It was 14 pages long. It covered the timeline of events from the moment the distress beacon was received to the moment the last Vreth prisoner was transferred to the transport holding facility. It was clear, complete, and written in the plain language that military reports are supposed to use. At the very end, after the last numbered section and before the signature block, Briggs added one additional paragraph. Regulations did not require it. It was simply his own observation, written in the same plain way as the rest of the report. It said, "This unit responded to a civilian distress beacon from Verith 5 colony, which sits in a zone listed as contested under current cooperative treaty boundaries. The Cooperative Emergency Council chose not to respond. Terran forces launched under the standing humanitarian mandate that has guided this unit since its formation. All 411 colonists were recovered safely. No Terran casualties were sustained. All Vreth detainees were treated according to standard handling protocols and transferred to cooperative legal custody. It is the opinion of this officer that the current authorization framework for responding to distress signals in contested zones requires serious review. Until that review happens and a better system is in place, this unit will continue to respond to civilian distress calls regardless of the territorial status of the zone in question, because that is the reason this battalion exists." His commanding officer, Brigadier General Ruth Kamara, read the report from her office on the station. She was a tall woman with short gray hair who had served for 31 years and was not easily impressed. She read the report once normally and then read the final paragraph a second time. She signed the report without changing a single word. She forwarded it to Cooperative Command with a cover note attached that said only, "Concur." The Cooperative Council received the report at their next general session, which took place 9 days later in a large chamber on the Cooperative Central Station. 17 species were represented in the chamber. It was a room built for long conversations about difficult subjects, with wide seats and good acoustics and translation units at every position. Several delegates expressed concern about the unauthorized launch. They used careful language, phrases like unilateral action and established response protocols and the importance of coordinated decision-making in sensitive territorial zones. The concern was real, not performative. These were not bad people. They were people who had built a system over many centuries and who believed, with genuine conviction, that the system worked. Euroameth, the Velkai representative, was 94 years old and had served in cooperative diplomacy for 40 of those years. She was small and quiet and she spoke rarely at full sessions, which meant that when she did speak, people listened. She waited until the expressions of concern were finished. Then she said, in a calm and unhurried voice, that perhaps the Council might find it more productive to spend less time discussing unauthorized human action and more time discussing the 14 worlds that were still waiting on deferred response authorizations, some of which had been waiting for more than 3 years. The session was tabled for further review. On Verith 5, the colony returned to its normal work. The ore processing units came back online. The extraction teams went back to their schedules. The gate was repaired by Owen Draper using parts he had in his workshop, because requesting replacement parts through official channels would take at minimum 4 months, and Owen had always been faster doing things himself. Petra Stamos sent a formal letter of thanks to the Terran Republic Defense Directorate. The letter was received, processed, and sent back in the form of a printed commendation certificate addressed to the 9th Rapid Response Battalion. The certificate arrived 2 weeks later. Briggs put it in his desk drawer without reading it and forgot about it. Lena Carr received a short message from Nina's mother, a woman named Carol, who had found Lena's contact information through the official liaison office and written a 3-sentence note. The note said, "My daughter asks about you every day. She wants to know if you are safe. I hope you are." Lena wrote back. She said she was safe and that Nina sounded like a good kid. She kept the message short because she was not good at long personal letters, but she sent it the same day she received it. Surith, the old Velkai woman, sent a message of her own, not to a government or a military office, but to her family on the Velkai homeworld. She wrote it in her own language, in the long, careful style that her people used for important communications. It was a personal account of what she had seen on the night the lights went out in the hub on Varith 5. She described the distress beacon that went unanswered for 11 hours. She described the Vreth soldiers and the colonists held in one room and the long, tense wait in the dark. She described the lights going out and the doors opening and the Marines coming through them in silence. She described a woman named Petra standing in front of a Vreth commander and saying, "Not everyone out here is the cooperative," and meaning it as both a warning and a kind of hope. She described a young Marine named Lena Carr crouching down in a storage room so that frightened children could see her face, and speaking in a calm voice, and telling them they were safe now. She described what it felt like to sit in a mess hall at 4 in the morning and watch a military officer drink bad coffee and explain, without drama, that there were children on a manifest and so someone was always going to come. Her account was passed along by her family to a wider circle, and from that circle to a wider one still, the way true things sometimes travel, not through official channels, not through news reports, but through the simple act of one person saying to another, "You should hear what happened." It reached places Surith never expected it to reach. It was translated into 11 languages. It was read by people who had never heard of Varith 5 and never would visit it. She had ended the account with a single line, which translators rendered in different ways depending on the language, but which all pointed at the same thing. When the dark comes and you have pressed your beacon and the silence stretches out long and you begin to think that nobody is coming, listen carefully. You may hear boots in the corridor. They always come.